Okay, we thank everybody for being here. This is a very important and timely policy forum. Again, under the leadership of Jessica Tucker, I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful presentation. And I understand Superintendent White is going to lead off.
I am. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to work with us on this, hear us on this presentation. As you know, we have Nancy Beeben, Molly Horstman, and Beth Gleason from our team, 3 people who have done a lot of work in each of these realms. And so they are going to field questions, and they should feel free to jump in on pieces of the presentation where I fall short. But I'm going to move quickly through this presentation. What I really want to thank our staff for, and to make you aware of, is that we have been spending a lot of time in communities recently trying to communicate as much as we possibly can about the implementation of Act 54 and Compass, and so and the Common Core standards. And so I'm so happy to be here to talk about it today. We start with the idea, and I think we don't focus on this enough, that thanks in great part to people here and people at the board level, but really because of the work of our educators, the percentage of kids reading, writing, and doing math on grade level in this state has increased tremendously over the last 12 years. And you see that that is happening across our subgroups, so that actually achievement gaps between African American white students, for example, between middle-income kids and low-income kids, are all shrinking. And so all of Louisiana's kids are participating in the progress that this state has made educationally over the last decade. But to talk a little bit about, just in terms of the statistics, to bring it down to a child level, just to talk about what happens to a child who comes into our school system. If 100 children enter Louisiana high schools, 70, 71 will graduate within 4 years from that high school. 49 will enter a college roughly after that, and 19 will finish an associate's or bachelor's degree ultimately within 6 years. And then the numbers trail off dramatically over that time. So that is a humbling number. We have to know that a 19 out of 100 is not the degree attainment that's going to fuel our state for the 21st century. It's going to continue to keep our state as a place where jobs for high school dropouts and high school graduates are high, but jobs for college graduates are low. And that is not the path to a 21st century economy. The path is having a school system that provides every child with a college degree or a professional career. And so the question really is, how do we get there? Well, we have 2 answers, and I think too often, board members, these things are thought about as different enterprises. But what we've realized under Molly's leadership and Beth's leadership and Nancy's is that these 2 are exactly the same question. And I think this is probably the most important concept in this presentation, that the idea of the change in student standards that you have adopted and the change in teacher standards that you have adopted are one and the same. They are a calling to a different mode of instruction. And this really, to me, is the great challenge of the years ahead. It is how classroom to classroom do we use these incredible tools, the change in the Common Core standards and the change to new teacher effectiveness standards, to change classroom practice, to continue our momentum. It's been teachers that are the reason that we've gotten where we are, and we can help our teachers grow through changing mindsets about what's possible for teachers and for students. And so the objectives of what it is that we've been out doing is to give really, really good information about the department's current work on these initiatives, to talk about how we're going to support districts going forward, and to provide a view of what's going to be needed at the BESE level going forward. With respect to the Common Core standards, this is about a change in expectations. And I'm not going to walk through all of these shifts, but I think it's fair to say that as I talk to teachers, and I've been meeting with groups of teachers on a daily basis over the last month to talk about this issue, as you talk to teachers, what they understand is that, and need to understand, is that this is not about, we're teaching transforming equations in one grade as opposed to another. It's about actually a change in the concept of what a standard is in the first place, to be not 50 things you need to cover in a given year, but to be what level of student work do we actually want our children to be able to produce. And this is a radical thing for teachers, because so often when you ask them about how do they think about their job, in some respects they think of it in terms of, well, my district asked me to cover this week, this week, this week. And what we're saying is that still well could be the case, but what our GLEs, in essence, under the Common Core will focus on is, how would you describe what your students should be able to do? And that is a fundamentally different question and a much more complex question for our teachers to wrestle with. So we have the next couple of years to frame this extraordinary mindset shift and great opportunity for our teachers. And so you see, just take a minute, and audience members as well, to review the distinction. Nancy's been good enough to provide this distinction. And one thing that I think that I'm so excited to do is now to really delve with teachers into these kinds of exercises where you look at, so this is what used to be required. This is what is now required. And you see that what's happening in the first case is that essentially people are being asked, what do you think about something? Tell us about yourself. In the second question, you see what's being asked is a complex higher order activity of comparing, that the student is being asked to draw evidence from another text and is being asked to use that evidence as basis for their argument. And that's a fundamentally different level of complexity in what we're asking of the student. And when you raise this up through the high school level, you realize that essentially what's being asked of our students is to do what we currently expect of college students in our high schools. And the complexity continues, and we don't have to go through this in too great detail, but through the curriculum. We have established a schedule over the course of the next several years for how curriculum and how assessment will be phased in so as to make this transition. And I'm not going to walk through it, but I'm imagining you'll have questions about this, and Nancy Bevan will be able to answer questions about that change. And as you see on slide 13, this will mean assessments will change gradually. This will mean that standards will change, obviously. And this will mean that curriculum will change in our state. And it will happen staged at various grade levels over the course of the next 3 years, such that by 2014, 2015, we will have new assessments designed across 24 states, that will reflect our standards, that will reflect our curriculum. And we're doing this in concert with other states so that actually ultimately, by the time we get phased in, this won't be about, is Calcasieu performing better than the neighboring district, or is Orleans performing better than the neighboring district? It will be about how are we performing relative to neighboring states. In fact, how are we performing relative to dozens of other states that are taking the exact same tests with the same cut scores. And that in and of itself is a real shift in how we think about accountability. And so the question for us is, how do we get our teachers ready for that shift? You can, in essence, see that as we make these changes, these are in essence at their core changes to the GLEs. And the GLEs are the places where our teachers turn for guidance as to what exactly it is that they're supposed to teach. And Nancy can walk us through that as well if you have questions specifically about it. But we wanted to give you an overview of this significant shift. And at the same time to note that even before this, that we're being engaged with our teachers, first working on the question of their own day-to-day work. And so as we make this shift in teacher standards, we're asking our teachers themselves to start engaging in a discussion about professional practice through the implementation of our COMPASS system, which is the professional development and feedback system that comes out of Act 54. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but as you know, and we've been sharing this with the public, students who start in the same place will finish in a radically different place depending on the quality of the classroom teacher. And this is not, a concept that's new to anyone here, but it's an important one to reinforce. That is why the legislature passed Act 54, which requires that 50% of evaluations be based on student growth and that 50% be based on professional experience and an assessment of the teacher's professional experience. And that we have changed over time at the BESE level our own regulations to use the value-added model where that data is available, to use student learning targets for teachers where there are not those data, and that we will use a rubric or another approved rubric to observe classroom practice. But I think that one thing that maybe because this has been talked about at the policy level rather than at the classroom level, that has been this system has maybe been more mystified than it needs to be. And let me just give you an example. I walked through what I think are the three basic components of this, because I think this is real simple. Principals getting out from their offices and observing teachers in classrooms. Like, that's the basic element of this, giving feedback to teachers. Setting goals with teachers. This is what you want to achieve this year. And checking in from time to time to say, well, are you achieving the goal? How are you doing on your practice? That's really what this is about. So I laid that out. I was just in a meeting with Debbie Shum with about 100 CTE coordinators. And one of them just raised their hand midstream and she just says, I need to just interrupt you for a second. We're already doing that. And I said, exactly the point. We are already doing this. So people who want to mystify this process as if this is something that is somehow abnormal, out of the ordinary, good educators that are working hard for their kids are already doing this. And so I think we make a mistake as bureaucrats when we make it either more complex than it needs to be or more political than it needs to be, when in fact this is something that's already happening. Now, I do think we need to commit to simplifying it, because this is a simple act of observing teachers, setting goals, and giving feedback. We need to simplify it. No 16-page forms, no audits from Baton Rouge, no burden for one person to do all this, because the greatest implementation problem that we could have is if we create a system that keeps principals in their offices rather than gets them out of their offices. And that's the key to execution. And we're committed to simplifying it, which is why we're piloting it, so that we can learn how you actually ultimately implement this, and Molly and Beth can certainly talk about that. So as you see on the next slide, that's really what this looks like. Set goals, observe, evaluate, done. Some teachers will receive, as we said, value-added data. If you have a standard assessment that we can use to show growth, then we have a statistical measure of the value that you have added. And I do think one thing we've got to be very clear with our teachers, that this is the fairest way we have to calculate their growth of their students based on not just how well do their kids do at the end of the year, but based on where did they come in, based on the challenges that they face. And that actually what you see when you run the model is the teachers who teach high numbers of kids with IEPs do quite well in this. The teachers who teach high numbers of kids who have high poverty do quite well in this. Why? Because we are, as Beth can detail, actually giving, in essence, teachers credit for those challenges by saying that a child would be expected to perform this well based on the challenges they have, not that every child is typically going to perform at exactly the same level. Now, a lot has been made also of teachers who don't have those data. And what I would emphasize is it is common sense, it should be an expectation of all principals and teachers that even if you don't have statistically valid data, that you set a goal and you're measured on that goal. I expect it of my staff. I'm sure everyone in the room expects it of their staff or does it themselves. And we should do it for our teachers. Our teachers are owed a sense of this is concretely what I want you to achieve this year. And so setting goals with teachers should not be considered abnormal. It should be the norm. The goal-setting process is simple. Teachers and principals sign off on a goal. We give you guidance, teachers and principals sign off on the goal, and then they're held accountable to it. And as you see, we give some guidance through exemplars about what a strong student learning target would look like. And we, for instance, will say to a school, if you have a music teacher, this is what an assessment, a strong goal would entail. This is what a weak goal would entail. And it's our expectation that if it's a music teacher, it's an art teacher, if it's a carpentry teacher, what have you, that there be goals. But we don't have a value-added assessment for it, and that shouldn't stop us from, at the same time, being accountable for student learning. So at the school level, what this looks like is on slide 26, that with all teachers, they will be observed. They will be observed by administrators. Now, as I've said to others, first school where I worked had 200 teachers, 200 classroom teachers. We're not expecting that principals be the only ones who do this. We're not expecting the principals be the only ones who set goals with teachers. Deans, APs, department chairs, lead teachers, et cetera, can observe, can set goals with teachers. And we provide a rubric that will ensure that when observations are done, that in the areas that hundreds of educators came together and agreed were the most valuable areas to observe for Louisiana teachers, that when we do observations, we're actually measuring, well, did this teacher do the things that matter for student learning? And that then principals can give feedback on this. And we've got to make this as easy a tool to use as possible. But it's important that we have this guidance to guide our classroom observations. And educators across the state came together to build this rubric. It's also important to note that if you already have a rubric that you're already using to observe practice, such as the TAP rubric, just please tell us. We'll consider whether or not it's appropriate, and if it is, we'll let you use that one. We're not trying to create a one-size-fits-all solution here. And when you see a lot of TAP schools and TAP districts will say, well, can we just use TAP? Of course you can just use TAP. This is one tool that was developed by Louisiana educators. We give guidance about a minimum number of observations that should be done. And we give guidance, as I said, about what kind of rubrics can be used in the process. And so why don't we skip just to the end of this part of the presentation, as there's a lot of detail, and just talk about the integrated implementation strategy. I think that the key thing that we want to emphasize today is that, and please do, read the background, and if there's questions we can answer about that as well. I don't want to go on for too long. That we not have teachers have to receive these as two separate initiatives. That in the end, this is about student learning and professional practice, and you can't separate those two things. So we need to bring these together to give schools a view of, so what can you do now on both fronts? And we're organizing our efforts so that Nancy's team and Molly's team are as closely aligned as possible to do this work together. So we're out working, talking to principals now on a regular basis, talking to district administrators on a regular basis about what exactly they can do to begin to get this ready to implement. We're going to assign what we're calling network team leaders to districts, so the districts have one point of contact to hear from on this question of their readiness to implement Compass and the Common Core. And ultimately, we've got to get this down to the teacher level, so the districts and schools are preparing their teachers for the implementation of Compass and subsequently for the Common Core. So you see on slide 43 a schedule of district engagement going ahead. We've rolled out in February across each district a set of meetings that district leadership has been invited to really nail down nuts and bolts. We've got a support team, as I said, identified for each district that's going to help coordinate trainings. We're going to begin work then with that network team to deepen district leadership's understanding of their strategy and to assess the readiness of each district to implement Common Core and Compass. And then we're going to start really deepening the training at a principal and a teacher level over the course of the spring and over the course of the summer, so that we'll be ready for a full-on implementation of Compass come this fall, and so that we will have really begun a broader, beyond kindergarten and 1, implementation of the Common Core standards to begin to ready schools across the state for the adoption of those standards. In terms of BESE's role, there are policy pieces associated with a lot of this. One is that we have, as we discussed yesterday, a certification change in policy to align with the mandates of Act 54. There are going to be continued policy refinements, especially around accountability, to align with the Common Core. And we're going to have to look at questions of curriculum. We're going to have to look at questions of courses and grad requirements and so on in order to fully align our system with the Common Core. And ultimately, of course, this is going to be a great topic of conversation amongst many of your constituents as well. But I would say this: I think that in the end, while there will be many people who want to talk about this as in a political context, or want to talk about it in a somehow, this is so complex context, in the end, this is a classroom question. And we have a choice when it comes to performing on a national level as to whether or not our classrooms are going to be equipped to actually deliver national level standards and translate that into classroom practice. And there's no way to do that other than from the state level, the district level, and the school level to work in unison, classroom by classroom, on the question of how do we ensure that teachers understand what's expected of their students, and how are we helping them translate that into classroom practice. And that's the work that we're here to discuss with you today. So we thank you so much for engaging us in the presentation and look forward to your questions.
Okay. Is that complete, the presentation? Okay, so staff stands ready for questions.
Stand ready for questions.
Okay. I'll start on one end like I normally do. And Ms. Beebe, if you're ready for questions?
I'd like to listen to the other concerns.
Okay.
If you will.
Sure, absolutely. Then I'll start with Ms. Bothy.
So I really want to thank you for connecting the two, both educator effectiveness and the Common Core, because I think that that's really going to help our implementation in the state. And I know that other states are working to do the very things that we're doing, so I really think we're getting past the political aspect of this and actually talking about how we can go into the implementation part. I also want to thank you for connecting the point that the Compass is about the professional development and the feedback for our teachers, and that when we start having those conversations about using this information to help teachers grow, we're really going to put us in a better position to be successful. One question I have is real specific and at the classroom level is how can teachers access the new transitional curriculum? Where can they find it? One fear I have is that looking at this timeline, that there'll be some teachers who will just start hearing about it a couple of days before they're expected to implement. And I do understand that we have some districts in particular who have taken leadership and are working hard to make sure that their teachers are ready. But we have a wide range in the way our districts are treating it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for that question. We are currently working on the transitional curriculum, and we will plan to have it completed in early June, but we will definitely have some of it available for teachers before they leave school this spring, at least the first couple of units. In terms of letting teachers know what's coming, we have been providing training throughout the year. One of the things that you saw on the slides there was a document that will let teachers know exactly what content they need to teach next year, and we provided training on that, and one of the things we're going to be doing with these teams is contacting each district and making sure that every teacher in the state has had that available to them so that they know what they're going to be teaching.
So is the document letting teachers know what they're going to be teaching next year? So not necessarily the curriculum, but the document identifying what they'll be teaching next year. Is that available online for teachers?
Yes, ma'am. That has been available since the fall.
Okay. Thank you. No, I have other
No,
questions.
that's why we're here. We have
Okay.
plenty of time.
All right, so the other questions go more under the, fall under the value added, so under the compass. And I know that there are particular things that are calculated into the student growth target, but I think it's important for us to revisit that because the questions that I keep getting from constituents are about, well, what if my class has a lot of students with disabilities and those types of questions. So I think it's important for us to reiterate all of the different components that are factored in.
Yeah, I can cover the variables that go into the calculations for the students' growth. So by law, it's actually set in the policy that we have to include these specific variables for students. So we have to include prior achievement, which is by far the biggest predictor of how a student's going to achieve in the future. And we can use up to 3 years prior achievement data on those students. We include student absences, their disability status, their gifted status, free reduced lunch status, Section 504 status, limited English proficiency status, and then also their prior year discipline history, so suspensions and expulsions. And another big component we include are classroom covariates, which take into account just those specific factors. So how many students with special needs are in a teacher's classroom, how many of those students are receiving free lunch, the average suspension rate for the students in that classroom, and then the average prior achievement history for the students in that classroom go into the calculations.
Okay, so we have, I just want to make sure I understand. So we have a student growth target for individual students, plus we have a way to factor in the demographics of the classroom altogether, so the dynamics of the classroom.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So another question is how this looks in our pilot program with our students with special needs, and then also I know our gifted students are under special ed, but how it also looks for our gifted students. I'm just curious as to how the numbers are working out for the effectiveness of the teachers.
Right, and those are great questions because we do get those whenever we go out in districts. People are concerned about the teachers with high percentages of students with special needs or gifted students. And actually, for the special needs students in particular, including those classroom covariates, specifically the number of students with special needs, controls for that factor. It really helps those teachers. They look just like everybody else. They're receiving the same results across the board. Some are ineffective, some are effective, some are highly effective. They are not looking any worse or any better because of that factor. And then that's actually why we included that classroom level predictor in there to control for that. Because if you have a classroom with a lot of special needs students, it might be more complicated to teach those students. So we do take that into account. And the same thing with the teachers with gifted students. They are looking just like everybody else in our numbers. Some are ineffective, some effective, and some are highly effective. And there is a big concern that for gifted teachers, it's harder for them to reach those high-level results because their students are achieving at such a high level. We've looked into it, and in our data specifically, and those teachers are still able to score those high results. And we are actually going to take that into consideration for calculations in the future, where we're going to have at least a 5-point leeway for those teachers, no matter what, for the gifted students. We will never expect a student to score higher than a 495 on a test. The max is a 500. And so that way, those gifted teachers are given that special consideration for those students who are achieving very, very high levels. But across the state, that is a very minimum number of students who are actually doing that.
Okay, and I think another question that is probably the most popular question right now is why the default to ineffective if you score in the I think it's like 1 to 1.9 range. So why the default to ineffective?
Can I let me just give a quick view on this. I think that we need to recalibrate we need to calibrate our expectations against what the current situation is, and I think that there's that piece of context, and then Molly, you should certainly jump in on this. We right now evaluate 98.3% of our teachers as satisfactory across the state, and then 1.5 roughly are unsatisfactory. And I think both of those things are doing injustice, because just calling, in my view, the teachers who work 15-hour days to move their kids and make extraordinary gains in their lives, which I think is the vast majority of our teachers, just calling them satisfactory, I think is an insult. I personally find that insulting. On the other hand, I think that if we were being real with ourselves, we probably would also admit that just 1.5% of our teachers probably is a small number relative to the number that actually should be getting some feedback that's a little more like, you're not quite at the top. And so the question then is, how do we shift our expectations as an industry toward a place that's more honest about the fact that we have really wide levels of difference across of teacher performance across our schools? If we don't, then we're never going to be real about the fact that we've got to keep people in the classroom who are doing the job well, and there's a small number that maybe we should be calling a more difficult question on. And so the question is, how do we do that? Well, if we were to simply say, let's leave everything up to kind of the system as it currently exists, we probably would end up, frankly, with a distribution that looks pretty much like the distribution that looks now. And so the question is, how do we do this? How do we actually start to shift our expectations as an industry without risking unfairness to teachers? And so what we've proposed is, yes, let's have a little bit of a forced ranking of people, where we say that the bottom 10%, we rank you ineffective. But let's at the same time not tie any immediate job consequences to being ranked ineffective. And I think this is something, so you're ineffective. You receive an ineffective rating because you're in the bottom 10%. Frankly, my view is if we're really interested in children and their welfare, we'd be calling that out. But at the same time, doesn't mean you're fired. The law says you get put on an improvement plan. So what's wrong about saying that someone's, I'm not saying you're suggesting, Ms. Bophy, but I think some have, that someone's ineffective, we put you in an improvement plan, and we hope you get better. That's what the law says. And this, we think, is the best way of starting to shift our mindsets about what we should be expecting of our teachers, and at the same time being fair to them by saying, just because you're rated ineffective means our job is to help make you effective.
I do want to point out that I think and this is because I'm working with other states on their teacher effectiveness, I think that the fact that we have the 3 years is a benefit to us, considering all of the other factors, because once you look at the fact that it is 3 years, that you have to fall into that category for 3 years for the true consequences to come, I think it puts the focus on the fact that this is about professional development and improving practice. So I appreciate that component of it with all of the other factors considered. I know that the different time period is working in other states because they're dealing with different situations. So so the other question, and I want to understand this. I want to be able to talk about it because I want to be your best advocate for this teacher evaluation program. It's very important to me that we're successful with this and that we help our teachers to grow. So if you could walk me through the process of the value-added score, I would appreciate it.
Okay. I will try to do it as quickly and simply as I can. So to calculate the value-added results, it all happens at the end of the year after students have taken the current assessments. That's one of the biggest things that's important for people to understand. It happens after students take the tests. So we get all of our students and we have their current assessments. From those, we take those predictor variables that I had mentioned earlier, and we look at how students across the state are doing in our state with those particular variables. Each of those variables are then given a weight or just a number that says, so if a student with this prior achievement, this is how much weight should be given to that variable. So then we have a calculation. We have a formula. All of those predictor variables that I discussed are given a specific weight that is then used for the student. So for example, a student with a specific learning disability We don't expect them to score the same as a student who's labeled as gifted. And that's taken into consideration. And that's going to show up in that student's formula. If they have a specific learning disability, we know that, and we multiply then that by that expected score for that disability status, which is usually like a -7 points or some. Don't know the exact number, but let's say roughly 7 points. Okay, good. So then what we do is we have a formula for each student. We also take into consideration the grade level of the student, because across the state, the way students score in each grade is different. So we take that into consideration. We also take into consideration how many years of data we have on a student. So the more years of data we have on a student, the better. So we break it up by that as well. So then we have a typical score for a student is calculated. All that happens next is we simply subtract that score from what they actually scored. Those differences then are rolled up to a teacher, and that's the teacher's value-added result. In very layman's simple terms. There's more statistical stuff that goes into it, but to quickly state it that way, we look at how students are doing across the state. We look at how that student is doing themselves, create that typical score, and then simply subtract it from what they actually scored.
So the information, how's this information then communicated back to teachers? Because I think that this is going to be part of the key to our success, is how we communicate this back to teachers so that they can then use that information to improve their practice.
Exactly, and that is something we are working on. Currently right now what they see is they can go online to the CVR web portal and they get results reports they can print out, they can look online. What they get currently is a specific value-added result by content. So if they teach multiple content areas, they're going to have a different score for every content that they teach. And that's going to be a number ranging anywhere from 0 out to a +50, down to a -50. And what that score actually means is that, let's say you get a 5. If your score is a 5, on average, all the students you taught in that content scored 5 points higher than what would be typical of them, based on those factors we discussed. And so that's what that number means. They also get a percentile for each content that they teach. That tells them how they did compared to their peers in that content area. So a 60% would mean in math, say it's in math, you did better than 60% of the other teachers in the state who teach math. Your students scored that much. And then we give them, okay, so we get those, and they get breakdowns. We also provide them breakdowns of different subgroups of students. So we look at how they perform for students with disabilities versus students without disabilities. Their students with free lunch versus their paid lunch students. Their limited English proficiency students versus not. And then achievement history. We break that into the top 25%, the middle 50, and the top 50%, so average, high, and low achieving students. And we tell them how they do with each of those students as well. What we have to progress to in the future to bring all of this together with the other portion of Compass is to provide them with, they will get an overall percentile, which tells them how they effective, so that the percentile, the bottom 10%, would then be labeled ineffective.
I want to thank you for communicating that much information so that teachers, I see that it's not on a student basis, but that teachers can at least look at it on a group basis.
Yes.
So you would have saved me a lot of time when I was in the classroom if I would have had that report. I think I'm finished.
Oh, okay. Ms. Boakey's going to yield the floor to other members. Mr. Whitmer.
I want to say I'm never going to share the questions with Ms. Boakey again that I was going to ask, okay? No, I appreciate the information. It's very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank the superintendent and you all for this presentation, because I think it was very clear, very concise, and very easy to understand. And I think going forward, this is going to be very productive for our teachers and for the citizens of our state. I do know that the one real concern is for the practicality of usage in making decisions, corrections, improvement. The timeline is so critical, and I know we will improve in that as we go along and get our systems in place, but I do think that's just one thing that we have to be real aware of and considerate that is going to be a question we're going to continue to get, and that we need to be prepared to have a good answer for that.
Thank you. Mr. Gilliard.
To follow up a little bit on the timeline, obviously generating this curriculum is a critical path for you at this stage and the teachers who are very anxious so that they can be as prepared as they can be. And there are a lot of other states moving towards the core curriculum and developing curriculum and so forth. What are your thoughts or plans relative to leveraging the work that's being done in other states so that Louisiana is not just focused on their own curriculum and kind of bottlenecked within that process?
I would say that to me this is one of the most exciting things about the Common Core State Standards, the fact that we're not in this alone. And we in Louisiana first developed curriculum because actually BESE asked us to assist districts because policy required districts to have curriculum aligned to standards. And many of our districts were really struggling with that because they didn't have the resources to do that. So BESE asked us to do that. Well, the way I feel now is we are providing a curriculum for our teachers with Common Core, but we're also looking at other possibilities. And I don't think that in the future Louisiana will be developing curriculum because we will have so many other sources out there that are aligned to common standards because everyone will be using the same standards. Another thing I think we're going to be looking to do is to work with other states to evaluate resources that are out there and make sure that we let our schools and districts know where there is really quality resources for them to use that have been reviewed by states who agree to a certain level of quality.
I think Nancy just phrased that last piece exceptionally well, which is, and I think board members, this is a critical thing to get our heads around, is that the state's role is going to shift, just by necessity, but I think also, as Nancy points out, by opportunity, toward being more of a curator of content, so to speak, than a producer of content. And that's true in some of the MFP language that we discussed, some of the governor's bills, as well as in the curriculum approach, and that we can look at content that's being produced in many corners, decide whether or not it's applicable and authorizable for Louisiana, but that's a different thing from producing it ourselves.
Mr. Gill? Does any other member have questions at this point?
May I make
Absolutely, Ms. Beebe.
I do want to start off by stating, in fact, yesterday I made reference to it, under Superintendent Pecord's administration, the National Teacher Quality Commission rated Louisiana an A+ for teacher effectiveness, and now I think Louisiana is rated a C-, and the article I read specifically addressed the tenure concerns. And I'm having some difficulty understanding the current rating when under Superintendent Pecord's administration and the A+ rating, tenure was in place. Also, I would like to say that I want to respond to Superintendent White's comment about the concerns raised by teachers about that we're doing, or the comment made by teachers that we're doing this now, and that is true. We've been evaluating for years, and I think this is where I'm having difficulty embracing all of this change in at such a rapid pace. I do note at the beginning of the screen, and I don't know if you can go back to that. Louisiana has made progress over the last 10 years, and I'm not saying that we need to be satisfied. And certainly we should always establish high expectations. So I wanted to make that point. Now, the big concern I have with Compass, and we're kind of making this light of this instrument. Yes, we can do Compass, and the qualitative part of the local evaluation. It's LeTap on steroids. We have done this before, and the legislature 2 years ago eliminated it, first because of the unfunded mandate. Mentors were in place and they didn't have the money to do that, and then it was a cumbersome process. so the legislature eliminated. So we're bringing back LATAP, and again, I will stress, on steroids, and I say that because it is quite demanding of administrators. Every administrator today is in the classroom as much as possible. We're forgetting that there are other things, other issues that arise that principals are responsible for. I do know a principal, I had a conversation with him the other day, and he spent 2 days in special ed discussions. That's a part of his responsibility. That's his role. In fact, we're going to relinquish a teacher's certification, possibly a revocation of certification, and allow deans of students and reading math facilitators to go in and observe. Many principals have communicated to me that they feel very responsible to their constituents, to the teachers, and they don't want to relinquish this responsibility. Also, and Mr. White, you pointed out that we have teachers will be placed on intensive assistance plans. We've been having this for years. In fact, we're stated that teachers have been rated satisfactory for years. Yes, that's because of the instrument. And I don't have a problem. In fact, we made, in my district, we changed from satisfactory to an unsatisfactory rankings to a numerical ranking, having the exemplary through unsatisfactory. So those things are in place. And then when we talk about the Act 54, in year 1, we put them on a teacher, an ineffective teacher, on an intensive assistance plan, and then possibly in year 2, and I'm quoting you, we had the conversation the other day, Superintendent White, you said in year 2, possibly the teacher could be recommended for termination if that is the desire of the district. In year 3, the certificate could be revoked. So I certainly, we could make light of it. I would not want deans and reading math facilitators responsible for a teacher's future, the livelihood. As far as Act 54, I need to ask you, ma'am, what is the margin of error in the value-added model?
Let me just respond to a couple of the comments first, and then I'll ask Ms. Gleason to respond. I think one thing you're calling out, Ms. Beebe, is really important, which is that we can't create more work for principals without being cognizant of what we're taking off of their plates too. And districts need to support in that effort, but I want you to know that we are committed, A, to simplifying this process, and then B, to making sure that there are things like school improvement plans, for example, which we're beginning to cut out, because I totally take your point. This cannot keep principals behind their desks. It has to get them out into classrooms. And I think that as you're calling out also, and I know this wasn't exactly your point, but I'll make my point this way. This is something that's just universal in good schools. People are observing teachers, people are setting goals, and they're giving feedback. And we've got to make sure that that's happening in every school, and that's really the aim of this process.
And once again, I appreciate your comment, but it's the speed at which we're implementing that. We're not opposed to evaluations. What we're saying is we need a full year of implementation to be fair to those other school districts who did not participate in the pilots. That's all we're asking, and that's why I'm going to emphatically state that every school system should have the same experience we were afforded as pilots, and I understand that we could volunteer, and maybe every parish was indeed asked to, if they wanted to participate in the pilot. But in fairness to the process, afford the full year of pilot implementation, because we will be, and the point I wanted to make, we're still achieving our objective. We will be evaluating teachers. And yes, your ultimate objective is to get the principal in the classroom. Many are in the classroom as we speak. This will be achieved through a full year of pilot implementation. But it has been suggested to me that there is a scorecard with little boxes that a governor wants to take to the Republican convention so that he can be the shining star. I will say it. And this is certainly, I think it's unfair to our teachers to have them placed in this process without giving them the opportunity to experience it. to fully understand it, and even with the Common Core standards. All of these things are being rolled out at the same time. Are we going to achieve success if we do this with haste? And I
Okay.
will go back and I will reiterate, haste makes waste. We're still achieving the objective. We're achieving teacher evaluation.
Thank you. I think you had a question for Ms. Gleason around the science around value added, and it's something I actually wanted. It's something that has come up in conversations around this issue. So I think I also was asked that question. So please respond.
Sure. It's a good question, and I apologize that I don't have exact numbers for you. The answer is it actually varies. It varies by how many students each teacher has that they're being held accountable for, their results being calculated for. The majority of our teachers have a large number of students because it's based by content, the content area that they're teaching. So most of the teachers have 20 plus students on their list, and the margin of error is very small. The margin of error gets larger when you have those teachers who have only 5 students that we might calculate for. And again, I apologize I don't have numbers. I can get some numbers for you though if you would like.
But to be one way of in essence accounting for, tell me if I'm wrong, Ms. Gleason, for accounting for a margin of error is you have a percentile ranking, and then within the percentiles we actually don't really differentiate in terms of consequences for teachers between the 10th and the 90th percentile. Is that right? Okay. And would it be fair to say that also not only is greater numbers of kids, but greater numbers of years actually would demonstrate greater certainty as well? Is that fair?
Yes, the more data we have, the stronger it is as well.
So if a teacher were to have performed in the bottom 10% for, say, 3 straight years, would that do more to, say, sort of eliminate the margin for error?
For that high level of that
Got it.
percentile, yes.
And given that that's really when consequences kick in the law, that it would seem that goes a long way towards saying if someone is in the bottom 10 percentile for 3 years, which is when the certificate is lost, that's really the harshest of consequences, and that really eliminates a lot of the margin of error.
Can I follow up with a question since we're on this topic? There's there have been some comments made that the 10% was arbitrary, and I was wondering if you could share with BESE members from a student's perspective what happens to a child who has had a teacher who is in this bottom 10%.
Definitely. I don't know if you've been discussing this a lot too. If you would like to address that, how you've been discussing it in the districts as well.
I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is,
right.
That this is about students, about student achievement, about serving our families.
That's a great question, and one that we actually considered as we were proposing that bar. What we understand is that a teacher who's in the bottom 10% in the data we currently have would be a teacher who's scoring with their students' growth that is 10 points or more below what was expected of them given all the variables Dr. Gleason discussed. And if a student has a teacher in that range for 3 years consecutively, they may start that 3-year period at a basic level and end that 3-year period down at an unsatisfactory level. So it's a tremendous impact on their academic trajectory if they were to have a teacher in that range consecutively over time.
Okay. And it's been suggested that that child would be better off being provided meals and I mean, actually this teacher does harm academically, that this child not only fails to progress, but in fact falls further behind. Is that correct?
Correct. They would be falling further behind.
Okay. There's also been, I was wondering if you could take us, no, I'm going to finish, and then I'll go back to you. There's also some questions around the ineffective rating and whether if an educator earns a 1.0 to 1.9 in either 50%, then the educator is rated ineffective. I'm not sure that everyone is aware that where that recommendation came from and that the board did adopt, but that is, so I was wondering if you can give us a short history on that.
Certainly. That recommendation did come through the ACE committee, which was the committee of stakeholders formed per the recommendations of the law to consider some key components of this system. And that was one of the final things they considered in defining the standards of effectiveness for Compass. And the recommendation was proposed with the rationale that we are averaging two scores from these two separate components of an evaluation system, and yet a rating of ineffective in either component would be cause for pretty serious concern and likely suggest a need for intensive support for that educator. And by combining the two scores, we didn't want that to be overshadowed. And so if there were concerns either from a professional practice perspective or the student growth perspective, we wanted that to be raised as a case where further investigation was needed and likely intensive support needed to be provided. And that's the rationale for ensuring that.
Thank you. Ms. Beebe, I'll go back to you, and then we'll go to Mr. Bennett.
And two, I also want to call attention to the fact that we have the value-added model that will be applied to the 33% of the teacher population and the 67% non-tested graded in subjects. And as I understand it, the teachers in the non-tested grades and subjects will determine their assessments, the pre and post-test. Is that still on the table? I know you're saying you're modifying the process.
That is still on the table. The policy that was approved in December, though, did allow for districts or schools to standardize those assessments if they saw fit for their local context, and we will be providing a list of common assessments that we believe are those most valid for those particular subject areas.
So I want to speak to the greatest concern communicated to me by teachers within this 33% population. Where is the fairness in this? That they don't get to design their instrument, and they're going to be held accountable and could possibly have their certificates revoked, whereas the 67% they get to design their tests. And I understand you're saying that the district can more or less identify the assessment or approve the assessment. But once again, the big question, fairness. Where is the fairness in this process?
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, Ms. Beaufort. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I see it the opposite way in that my concern for the non-tested grades and subjects is that they don't have the objectivity of the numbers, and that and so that's where my concern is. You know, if you have a teacher, because we've talked about the politics and school boards making decisions and those types of things, and depending on the way people see things, people's perspectives. But looking at the numbers gives teachers the opportunity to look at their practice. And so so I actually see it the opposite way from that, in that our non-tested grades and subjects are going to have this argument of objectivity there. So I think...
I guess I would urge maybe that approach. I would also say that I think the first question is what's fair to kids. That's my question, is our evaluation system right now really fair to kids and parents, where it says that 98.3% of your teachers are exactly the same and the other 1.7 are somehow different. That to me does not strike me as a fair system. And so this is the best system that we have, given the fact that we know the current system is no good for kids. And if people want to suggest modifications to it, by all means. But right now we don't have an assessment that statistically measures art. And if the BESE board is interested in us continuing to develop that, then absolutely we'll look at it. But I think my response would be, this is the best thing we know how to do for kids. The current system is not fair to children. It's not fair. We do not have a fair evaluation system to children. And I'd like to understand if anyone thinks that we do. And if you accept that today's system is not fair for kids, then it's incumbent upon you to say, well, what's the best we can do? And we think this is the best we can currently do. Are we going to make it better? Absolutely. But this current system is not a fair system.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bennett.
This is probably too early to ask this question, but I'm going to anyway. Just the limited amount that I've looked at the standards and seen, I guess the question has to do with these standards are still largely skill-based, and that's, of course, as they should be. But is there going to be any effort to align skills, especially in science and the content area, science and social studies, but also like reading and literature? Is there going to be any effort to align content-specific material to the skills that are listed, or are we just going to leave that up to the districts or the teachers to decide what content they're using to teach certain skills that may be somewhat nebulous in terms of what you're going to actually teach?
I do think some parts of the standards are skill-based. I really do believe that. And in mathematics, we have the practice standards, the 8 practice standards that are really apply across the board. And I do think that in English language arts, there's an emphasis on a lot of the higher order thinking skills. I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to go to a meeting about the new science standards that are being developed. And I was really excited to see that there is a huge overlap with science and the math and the English along the lines you're talking about, along the lines of the practice. The math practice standards are very similar to the practice standards that are being developed for science. And the critical higher order thinking skills, evaluation of text, when you do a science experiment, the critical analysis that you do is very similar to the things that we're asking our students to do in English. So I hope that you'll see a lot more of that, Mr. Bennett, as you look at some of the resources and that will be developed.
Yeah, I really do, because it's if we're talking about continuity and cohesiveness, not just in the state but throughout various states, it would make some sense for us, this group of people that came together, to maybe also offer some content. I mean, I can look at some skills here, like in social studies, and you could pick the Constitution to teach that skill, or you could choose the Communist Manifesto. I mean, and maybe there should be some content that we say, this is what you will use to teach these skills. And I'm just offering that up for future use of where we may need to go. And Mr. White, I think you know the curriculum that I'm familiar with, why I'm saying what I'm saying. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions by board members? I'm going to ask Ms. Hill, since she hasn't spoken yet, and then Mr. Romer.
I have a question, I guess it's coming from as being a social worker and working in the schools. And when you look at the evaluation, there are so many psychosocial issues in the classroom when pertaining to the student in the classroom, as far as their basic needs may not be being met at home, or they may have mental illness that may have been underdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. So when you look at this evaluation, how would this play a factor in the evaluation of that child and that teacher as well? Is there a component in the evaluation that looks at those factors?
I guess I can address that from if the student falls under the value-added portion for that teacher. We don't have a way to measure that. We don't have data components based on that for a student. However, those factors generally play out in how a student has achieved in the past. So if they're not getting those resources, it's probably showing up on how they've achieved on the tests in the past. So that actually is kind of taken into consideration in a roundabout way, I guess you could say it that way, because that does affect how a student is going to score every year on their assessments.
Correct.
I would also just say that it's the rest of the evaluation is in the hands of the principal, and that actually for most teachers the evaluation is in the hands of the administrator, and to set the goal with the teacher, to observe the teacher, and the administrator has that context. And I think there are people that would have you think that principals and teachers have this universally combative relationship and so on, but when I'm out talking to teachers, I'm like, do you trust that your principal will do this in a fair way? And I have yet to hear one that has said to me, no, we think this principal is going to use this to abuse their trust. And I think there's some concern that there be an appeals process, and that's built into our system, and we have a process for arbitrating if there are issues. But people, in the end of the day, the principal and the administrator and the teacher are going to know the challenges best. And if a child acts out because they know that child's having problems at home, then clearly they're not going to say in their evaluation, well, you didn't control that child because that child didn't. They know that child's having those issues. So it's about local decision making rather than Baton Rouge or the school district office.
Well, I guess working in the schools and going to various schools, especially those low-performing schools, and to be honest with you, you have individuals that are in administrative position that may not know every child on what they're going through. And so sometimes that child may not be a problem child where he or she may not have to go to the principal's office on a daily basis. it may just be a child that may be sitting in the classroom silently, that may not be expressing or letting that teacher or their principal know what actually is really going on with them. And so I just want to make sure that we take all those things in consideration. And I think from a social work perspective and working in the schools and working closely with teachers and students and parents, those are some of the things that I've come across as I go into especially those low-performing schools as well.
Thank you. Mr. Romer.
I'll keep it, brief. I appreciate everyone's comments. I thought there's been a lot of good input from every board member and different perspectives, which I think is always valuable to hear. I would say that I appreciate that this was presented as a package, that two items were considered simultaneously because I think they are related. I would suggest that, in fact, there are several pieces of legislation and policies that are being considered now that, quite frankly, work together. And the key ingredient that we're trying to achieve is improvement more quickly. Yes, we've had improvement in this state, but it's been slow and painful and taken a long time. And I think the combination of these factors add up, hopefully, to a system that can more rapidly adapt and more rapidly improve. And the argument of waiting is one that I find not very persuasive. We've waited for too long. I mean, we keep using the same numbers over and over. We have 235,000 kids below grade level. To me, that argues for haste. That argues for let's move quickly. That argues for let's try something differently than what we've been doing. So I want to say this is a key piece, but not the only piece, in a series of policies that we're considering, with the whole idea actually of empowering people in the classroom more so than we do now, and providing them feedback so they can improve what they're doing. This is not meant to be punitive. As Ms. Bophy said, she wants to make sure there's elements within this to make sure that we properly communicate with teachers in the classroom so that, in fact, they can improve what they're doing. Because I believe the vast majority of our teachers, that is their goal, to be the best possible teacher they can be. But at the same time, we do have to recognize we have some that perhaps need more than just the criticism that we've been giving them thus far, which quite frankly is little or none. So I appreciate the efforts. I appreciate you presenting this as a package, and I'm hopeful that it will lead to better outcomes for our kids, and hopefully teachers that are more prepared and feel more confident and continue to improve in their own practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Romer. Okay, are there any other questions of board members? Ms. Phoebe.
And I'll be brief. Thank you, Ms. Dastu. And I do want to say that we do have many outstanding educators in Louisiana, and the criticism, there is much criticism aimed at them today, and many, our highly effective teachers, are making plans to leave the profession. I am getting telephone calls as a personnel director saying, Ms. Beebe, I'm leaving the profession. I have principals who, some have indicated that they want to buy a home or whatever, but they don't know the future as it stands in public education today. This concerns me, and that's why I'm taking the stand. Yes, it's about children, but it's also about adults who have committed many years to this education profession, and yes, they want to improve, and they want to achieve increase student achievement. And I do have a scenario here. A principal in my district provided it, and it's a teacher, a fourth grade teacher. She scored in the 21st percentile, and she had her students earn math 100%, the proficiency rate per class, ELA 84%, science 80%, social studies 85%. She scored in the 21st percentile. She would have been rated ineffective.
She would not have been rated ineffective. She actually would have been rated effective, as it's in that broad category. Now, there's also other components to her rating, obviously, that need to be taken into consideration, but I do want to be clear, she would not have been rated ineffective under this system.
Well, and you're looking at how the students are doing as opposed to how well they are improving. I think the whole purpose of the evaluation model is to see how well the teachers are moving children from where they are to where they should be. And, you know, if a teacher has a gifted class, they're always going to score in these high percentiles. But that not necessarily is that teacher who thinks she may be highly effective because her students are scoring high, is she moving those children and maximizing their ability? And I think that's a serious disconnect that exists that we need to work on.
And I will say that
Because how do you know someone's highly effective if all you're doing is 100% subjective evaluation? We're calling, I mean, I think the pilot has revealed teachers who thought that they were highly effective to find that, well, they can do better. And that's what this is all about, doing better for children.
I will end on this note, but if you do the research and you look at the articles, the information presented, other states who have implemented the value-added model, they are taking a closer look at it. They have great concerns, particularly with ranges of 33 to 53% error of margin.
Well, and I hate to engage in debate, but I will note that one thing that Louisiana does very well is its science.
As a personnel director, I am saying that there are many teachers who will exit the profession, many highly effective teachers as well as administrators. And yes, we can say that time is critical, but I'm saying we need responsible reform. We need to proceed and be responsible in doing so.
Okay.
I don't have an agenda.
Ms. Beebe, and board members, one final comment, I think I do get a chance to do that, is the science behind the value added in Louisiana is very, very good. We're recognized nationally, and we've been using it in higher education, evaluating our teacher preparation programs for many years. So if I would hope that you would avail yourself of that information, of just how strong that work that this department does on value added, and that we're bringing that expertise and success to this model. So what other states have experienced in their attempts at value added do not indicate to what Louisiana experienced, because we're frankly very good at it. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, can I make some closing comments?
Yes.
Sure, thank you. I just want to make 3 comments. Number one, I'm very excited by the discussion this morning and really appreciate it's so wonderful to have such informed comments with such a variety of experiences. Secondly, I think that going forward, there will be a set of work, as we said before, coming out of this for consideration by the BESE board, because all of these things are interrelated: accountability, graduation requirements, assessment, curriculum, standards for teacher effectiveness. All of these things are things that are tied into one program of classroom success, and we'll have to continue to evaluate them. And so we should anticipate some regulatory change coming out of this, as well as out of the legislative session starting soon. And so we'll have to take up these issues. And third, I just want to thank our staff. They've done a ton of work on this. This is, as Ms. Dastuk notes, incredibly sophisticated work. And so to all 4 of you, I really just deeply appreciate everything that you do every day. And it deserves the gratitude of all of us. So thanks to you.
Thank you. Okay, I think that unless there are further comments or questions by this panel, we'll go ahead and adjourn the policy forum.